I found out my propane tank was feeding someone else's pool heater on a Tuesday morning in March, when I noticed the gauge dropping faster than a lead balloon and my monthly bill had mysteriously tripled. My name is Brandon Lawson, and I had been living in the Meadowbrook Springs subdivision in Scottsdale, Arizona for about 8 months when this whole mess started. I bought the place because it was beautiful, had a decent backyard, and the price was right. What I didn't know was that the HOA here operated like a small dictatorship run by a woman named Barbara Hendricks who had more entitlement packed into her 5'4" frame than should be legally possible. I was standing in my backyard that morning, coffee in hand, staring at the propane tank that fed my gas grill, outdoor fire pit, and backup generator. The gauge read 30%. That seemed wrong. I had just filled the thing 3 weeks ago, and I hadn't used it nearly enough to justify that kind of depletion. My generator hadn't kicked on once. I had only grilled maybe 4 times, and the fire pit had been used for one evening when my brother came to visit. I set my coffee down on the patio table and walked over to inspect the tank more closely. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a secondary line running from my propane tank, snaking along the ground behind some decorative rocks, heading toward the fence line that separated my property from the community pool area. "What the hell?" I muttered, following the line with my eyes. Someone had tapped into my propane supply. Someone had actually run a line from my private propane tank to somewhere else on the property. I walked along the fence, following the line as it disappeared through a small gap near the bottom. I couldn't see where it went from my side, but I had a pretty good idea. The community pool was right there, and I had noticed the past few weeks that the pool area seemed to be open later than usual, with steam rising from the water even on cooler evenings. They were heating the pool with my propane that I was paying for. I pulled out my phone and took about 20 pictures of everything: the line, where it connected to my tank, where it ran under the fence, all of it. Then I went inside and pulled up my propane bills from the past few months. Sure enough, February's bill was $240. January had been $215, but back in December, before this line had apparently been installed, my bill had been $73. I was paying an extra $150 a month, maybe more, to heat a pool I wasn't even allowed to use during evening hours because of some stupid HOA rule about pool availability. I needed to figure out exactly what was happening before I made any moves. I grabbed my keys and walked around the block to the main entrance of the pool area. The gate was locked as usual during off hours, but I could see through the fence. There, next to the pool equipment shed, was my propane line, connected to what looked like a brand new pool heater. I took more pictures. Then I called my lawyer, a guy named Marcus Weinstein, who had helped me with my house closing. "Marcus, I need to ask you something weird," I said when he picked up. "If someone taps into my propane line without permission and uses my propane, what kind of legal issue is that?" "That's theft," Marcus said immediately. "Theft of services, potentially theft of property, depending on how you want to frame it." "Why, what happened?" I explained the whole situation. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then let out a low whistle. "That's bold. And stupid. Who did it?" "I'm betting it was the HOA. The line runs from my tank to the community pool heater. Do you have documentation?" "Pictures, bills, everything." "Good, don't touch anything yet. Let me look into Arizona law on this and get back to you. In the meantime, document everything. Times, dates, amounts. Build a case." I agreed and hung up, but standing there, looking at that line running from my property, something in me snapped. I had spent 8 months dealing with Barbara Hendricks and her little HOA board, sending me passive-aggressive letters about my trash cans being visible from the street and my grass being a 1/4 inch too long. I had paid my dues, followed their ridiculous rules, and kept my mouth shut. But this was theft. This was them literally stealing from me month after month, probably thinking I would never notice or never have the spine to call them out on it. I walked back to my house, went straight to my propane tank, and found the main shutoff valve. I looked at it for a long moment, my hand hovering over it. Marcus had said not to touch anything, to build a case first. But I was paying for propane I wasn't using, and they were stealing from me right now, this very second. I turned the valve to the closed position. The effect wasn't immediate, but I knew it would come. That pool heater was probably running right now, keeping the water at a comfortable 78 degrees for the afternoon swimmers. Once the propane in the line was used up, that heater would stop working, and whoever was in charge of maintaining the pool would have to figure out why. I went inside and tried to go about my day, but I kept glancing out the back window, waiting for something to happen. Around 2 in the afternoon, I heard raised voices coming from the pool area. I grabbed a beer from my fridge and wandered out to my back patio, settling into a chair where I could hear everything through the fence. "I don't understand. It was working fine this morning," a man's voice said. That sounded like Gerald, the pool maintenance guy. "Well, it's not working now, is it?" Barbara Hendricks's shrill voice cut through the air like a knife. "We have residents who paid extra for heated pool access, Gerald. This is unacceptable. I'm telling you, Mrs. Hendricks, there's no propane getting to the heater. The tank must be empty." "That's impossible. We just had it filled." There was a pause. I took a sip of my beer, thoroughly enjoying myself. "Wait," Gerald said. "This isn't connected to a tank. This line runs under this fence. What are you talking about?" "Mrs. Hendricks, this propane line isn't connected to a HOA tank. It's connected to someone's private tank. It goes under this fence into that yard." The silence that followed was beautiful. I could practically hear Barbara's brain working, trying to figure out how to spin this. "That can't be right," she said finally. "The board approved this installation. We were told it was connecting to the main community propane supply." "We don't have a main community propane supply," Gerald said. "Madam, I think someone tapped into a resident's personal tank." "Don't be ridiculous. No one would do that. I'm looking at the line right now. It goes straight into that yard. That's Mr. Lawson's property." Another beautiful silence. "I need to make some calls," Barbara said, her voice tight. I heard footsteps walking away, and I grinned. This was going to be good. About an hour later, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Barbara Hendricks standing on my porch, wearing a white pantsuit and an expression that tried to be friendly but came across as constipated. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "Barbara," I said, not inviting her in. "What can I do for you?" "Well, we've had a little situation develop at the community pool. It seems there's been some confusion about the propane line setup, and we've discovered that a line may have been accidentally connected to your personal tank." "Accidentally," I repeated flatly. "Yes, a simple mistake during installation. I'm sure you understand these things happen. Anyway, we were hoping you might turn your propane back on so we can sort this out properly." So she knew I had shut it off. "Interesting. Here's the thing, Barbara," I said, leaning against my doorframe. "That line has been connected to my tank for at least 2 months. My propane bills have tripled. So this wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a recent mistake. Someone deliberately tapped into my tank and has been stealing my propane to heat the community pool." Her fake smile slipped a little. "Now, Mr. Lawson, I'm sure we can discuss this reasonably. The HO is more than willing to reimburse you for any inconvenience." "Barbara, this is theft. You stole from me." "I don't appreciate your tone," she said, dropping the sweet act entirely. "The HOA has the right to access community resources for the benefit of all residents. My personal propane tank is not a community resource. Your property is part of this community, which means all resources within it can be utilized for the greater good when necessary." I actually laughed at that. That's not how property law works. That's not how any of this works. "You stole from me, Barbara, and I have documentation proving it." Her face flushed red. "You will turn that propane back on immediately, or I will have the board issue a fine." "Fine me for what?" "Shutting off my own propane supply to my own tank on my own property. For failing to maintain community standards and interfering with community amenities." "Try it," I said. "Please, go ahead and fine me. I would love to explain to a judge why I'm being fined for refusing to let you steal my propane." She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You're making a big mistake, Mr. Lawson. The HOA has authority here, and you will comply with our decisions or you will face consequences." "Get off my property, Barbara." "This isn't over," she hissed, turning on her heel and marching back to her car. I closed the door and immediately called Marcus back. "She just showed up at my door and threatened me," I said. "She admitted they tapped into my tank and said the HOA has the right to use my resources for the community." Marcus made a choking sound. "She said that?" "Word for word. She also threatened to fine me if I don't turn my propane back on." "Brandon, I need you to do something for me. I need you to file a police report, right now. What they did is criminal theft. Get it on record. Will the police actually do anything? Maybe, maybe not. But having that police report is going to be crucial when we take this to court. And we are taking this to court. I'll start drafting a lawsuit for theft, harassment, and whatever else I can think of." I drove down to the Scottsdale Police Department and filed a report. The officer who took my statement, a tired-looking guy named Officer Rodriguez, listened to my story and looked at my pictures. "So the HOA tapped into your propane tank," he said, shaking his head. "That's a new one. Is it theft?" "Yeah, it's theft. It's also trespassing. Potentially vandalism since they modified your property without permission. The problem is HOAs exist in this weird legal gray area sometimes. They'll argue they have the authority to do stuff like this. Do they? Hell no. But they'll try. Look, I'll file this report, and I'll have someone go out and document the line. But don't be surprised if this ends up being more of a civil matter than a criminal one. My lawyer said to get it on record. Your lawyer's smart. Get everything on record. HOAs can be nasty, and you want to cover yourself." I left the police station feeling somewhat validated but also frustrated. I had photographic evidence, documentation, and a clear case of theft, but because it involved an HOA, suddenly everything became complicated. Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. I received a certified letter from the HOA board stating that I was being fined $500 for interference with community amenities, and demanding that I restore propane access to the pool heater immediately. The letter was signed by Barbara and 2 other board members, Dennis Yates and Patricia Crawford. I forwarded the letter to Marcus, who called me back within an hour laughing. "They actually put it in writing," he said, sounding delighted. "They actually sent you a letter demanding you let them continue stealing from you. Brandon, they just handed us this case on a silver platter, so what do? We sue. We sue for theft, we sue for harassment, we sue for illegal fines, and we ask for triple damages plus attorney fees. I'll have the papers filed by the end of the week." True to his word, Marcus moved fast. By Friday, the HOA was served with a lawsuit. The amount we were asking for was $35,000, covering the estimated propane costs, the cost of removing and repairing the unauthorized line, emotional distress, and punitive damages. I didn't have to wait long for a reaction. On Saturday morning, I found my mailbox had been spray painted with the word traitor in red letters. I took pictures and filed another police report. That afternoon, someone left a bag of dog feces on my porch. More pictures, more documentation. On Sunday, I received an email from Dennis Yates, one of the other board members. It was more conciliatory in tone than Barbara's approach. "Mr. Lawson, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here. The board was told that the propane line installation was legal and approved. If mistakes were made, we'd like to work with you to resolve this without litigation. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to discuss a settlement." I forwarded the email to Marcus. "Do we want to settle?" I asked him on the phone. "Depends on what they offer. But honestly, I think we should push this. What they did was egregious, and if we settle quietly, they'll just do it to someone else. These HOA boards need to learn they can't operate outside the law. I'm fine with pushing it. I want everyone to know what they did. Then we push. I'll respond to the email and tell them any settlement discussions need to go through me." The following week was hell. Someone started a rumor in the neighborhood that I was trying to shut down the heated pool for everyone, that I was being selfish and unreasonable. I got dirty looks at the grocery store from neighbors. Someone egged my car. The harassment was constant and documented, but I also started getting support from unexpected places. A neighbor 3 houses down, a woman named Linda Foster, knocked on my door one evening. "Mr. Lawson, I just wanted you to know that not everyone in this neighborhood thinks you're wrong," she said. "My husband and I have had our own issues with the HOA. They're bullies. What they did to you is theft, plain and simple." "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched. "I appreciate you saying that. If you need a witness or a statement or anything for your lawsuit, let me know. We've been looking for someone with the spine to stand up to Barbara Hendricks for years." Over the next few days, I heard from 4 other families who had similar stories. The HOA had overstepped with them too, in different ways. One family had been fined repeatedly for having the wrong color curtains visible from the street. Another had been told they couldn't park their work van in their own driveway. The HOA had created an environment of fear and control, and people were tired of it. Marcus suggested we might be able to turn this into a class action if we could find enough people with valid complaints. I started keeping a list. Meanwhile, the lawsuit moved forward. The HOA's attorney, a sleazy guy named Richard Morrow, filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that HOA regulations gave them the authority to access and utilize resources within the community. The motion was denied. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Prisha Hernandez, said in her ruling that HOA authority did not extend to theft of personal property and that the case would proceed to discovery. Discovery was where things got really interesting. Marcus subpoenaed all HOA records related to the pool heater installation, including emails, meeting minutes, and financial records. What we found was damning. The HOA had known exactly what they were doing. In an email dated November 15th, Barbara had written to Dennis Yates, "The cost of installing a separate propane tank for the pool heater is prohibitive. I've identified that Mr. Lawson's property has direct access to the pool equipment area. We can run a line from his tank and save the HOA approximately $8,000 in installation costs. He's new to the community and unlikely to notice the increased usage." Marcus called me as soon as he read that email, practically shouting into the phone, "They planned this. They deliberately chose your tank because you were new and they thought you wouldn't notice. This is premeditated theft, Brandon. Can we use this in court?" "Absolutely. This email alone is going to win us this case. But there's more. They had 3 different contractors refuse to do the installation because it was illegal. They finally found some unlicensed guy who did it for cash. And get this, they paid him $2,000 from HOA funds, which means every homeowner in this subdivision technically funded the theft from you. So what happens now? Now we go to mediation, which is required before trial. But honestly, I think once their attorney sees this email, he's going to strongly advise them to settle. They have no defense. The mediation was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, the harassment continued, but so did the support. More neighbors came forward with their own HOA horror stories. Linda Foster organized a small group of us who met at her house to discuss potentially removing the current board members and reforming the HOA rules. The problem is that Barbara and her friends control the board, and they control who gets elected to the board, Linda explained. They've rigged the system so that only their approved candidates ever get nominated. That can't be legal, I said. It's not, technically. But challenging it requires money and lawyers, and most people don't want to fight. I have a lawyer, I said, and I'm already fighting. Maybe we can expand the lawsuit. Marcus was intrigued when I brought it up to him. HOA law is complex, but if we can show a pattern of abuse and corruption, we might be able to get a court to intervene. Let me look into it. The week before mediation, something happened that changed everything. I came home from work to find 2 police cars parked outside my house and Officer Rodriguez waiting on my porch. Mr. Lawson, we need to talk to you about something, he said, looking serious. My stomach dropped. What happened? We've been investigating your case, and we pulled records on the contractor who installed that propane line. Turns out he's not just unlicensed, he's been involved in some other questionable activities. When we brought him in for questioning about your case, he gave us some interesting information about the HOA. What kind of information? Apparently, this isn't the first time they've done something like this. He claims Barbara Hendricks has hired him multiple times to do work that wasn't quite legal. We're opening a broader investigation into the HOA's activities. But I wanted to give you a heads up, because this might complicate your lawsuit. Complicated how? If we find evidence of criminal activity beyond just your case, this could turn into a criminal matter, which is good for you in some ways, bad in others. It might delay your civil case. I called Marcus immediately and relayed the conversation. That's actually fantastic news, Marcus said. If the police are investigating the HOA for criminal activity, that puts way more pressure on them. Our mediation next week is going to be very interesting. He wasn't wrong. The mediation took place in a conference room at a neutral office building in downtown Scottsdale. On one side of the table sat Barbara Hendricks, Dennis Yates, Patricia Crawford, and their attorney Richard Morrow. On the other side sat Marcus and me. A professional mediator, an older gentleman named Frank Morris, sat at the head of the table. Barbara looked like she had aged 10 years since I last saw her. Her usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced with barely concealed anxiety. Morrow kept glancing at his clients with an expression that suggested he knew they were screwed. Frank Morris opened the mediation with the standard speech about how this was a non-binding discussion meant to facilitate settlement, and then he turned to Marcus. Mr. Weinstein, would you like to present your client's position? Marcus pulled out a folder and slid copies of Barbara's email across the table. This email, dated November 15th of last year, shows clear premeditation and intent to steal from my client. The HOA board, led by Mrs. Hendricks, deliberately chose to tap into Mr. Lawson's propane tank to save money, knowing it was illegal and hoping he wouldn't notice. Over the course of approximately 3 months, they stole an estimated $1,500 worth of propane from him. When he discovered the theft and shut off his own propane supply, they threatened him, harassed him, and attempted to fine him for refusing to continue being victimized. Morrow cleared his throat. That email is being taken out of context. The HOA board believed they had the authority to utilize community resources for the benefit of residents. A private propane tank on private property is not a community resource, Marcus shot back. And this email clearly shows they knew what they were doing was questionable at best. They deliberately chose my client because he was new and vulnerable. Frank Morris looked at the email, then at Barbara. Mrs. Hendricks, is this your email? Barbara's face was red. I may have written that, but the intent was misunderstood. We were trying to save the community money. By stealing from one of your residents, I said, unable to keep quiet. You stole from me, Barbara. You knew exactly what you were doing. We had the authority to make decisions for the community's benefit, she snapped. No, you didn't, Marcus said calmly. And what's more, my client has now connected with 7 other families in Meadowbrook Springs who have similar stories of HOA overreach and abuse. We're prepared to expand this into a class action lawsuit if necessary. Additionally, the Scottsdale Police Department is currently conducting a criminal investigation into the HOA's activities. So you have a choice here. You can settle with my client today for a reasonable amount, or you can face an expanded lawsuit, criminal charges, and the complete destruction of your HOA board's credibility. The room went silent. Morrow leaned over and whispered urgently to Barbara and the other board members. The whispered conversation went on for several minutes, getting increasingly heated. Finally, Morrow straightened up. What are you asking for? He said to Marcus. $15,000 to my client, covering all propane costs, damages, emotional distress, and attorney fees. The immediate removal of the illegal propane line at HOA expense. A written apology from the board to be distributed to all Meadowbrook Springs residents explaining what happened. The resignation of Barbara Hendricks from the HOA board. And a complete revision of the HOA bylaws to include proper oversight and prevent this kind of abuse in the future. Barbara stood up so fast her chair fell over. Absolutely not. I am not resigning. Then we'll see you in court, Marcus said pleasantly. And when we win, which we will, you'll be personally liable for damages. We'll put liens on your house, Barbara. We'll garnish your wages. And you'll still probably face criminal charges for theft. Your choice. Morrow grabbed Barbara's arm and pulled her back down, having another urgent whispered conversation. Patricia Crawford, who had been silent this whole time, spoke up. I think we should settle. This has gone too far. We made a mistake, a serious one, and we need to make it right. Patricia, you can't be serious, Barbara hissed. I'm completely serious. My husband is a lawyer, Barbara, and when I showed him that email, he told me we're screwed. If this goes to trial, we're going to lose, and we're going to lose big. The HOA's insurance might cover some of it, but we could be personally liable too. I have 3 kids in college. I can't afford that risk. Dennis Yates nodded slowly. I agree with Patricia. We need to settle. Barbara looked between them, her face a mask of fury and panic. Finally, she slumped in her chair. Fine, but I'm not resigning. Then there's no settlement, Marcus said immediately. Mrs. Hendricks's resignation is non-negotiable. She orchestrated this theft and she has to go. Another long silence. Finally, Barbara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Fine, I'll resign. But I want the settlement to include that I'm resigning for personal reasons. Not because of this. No deal, I said. Everyone needs to know what you did. That's the whole point. Mr. Lawson is right, Frank Morris said. If there's going to be a written apology explaining what happened, it needs to be honest. Otherwise, this settlement won't prevent future issues. It took another hour of negotiation, but eventually we hammered out an agreement. The HOA would pay me $18,000, accounting for all costs plus a bit extra that Marcus had pushed for. They would remove the propane line within 2 weeks and repair any damage to my property. A letter would be sent to all residents explaining what had happened and that Barbara Hendricks had resigned from the board. The HOA bylaws would be revised with input from a committee of residents, including me, and Barbara would not only resign but would be banned from running for the board again for at least 5 years. We all signed the settlement agreement. Barbara couldn't even look at me as she scrawled her signature. When it was done, she stood up and walked out without a word to anyone. Patricia Crawford approached me as we were packing up. Mr. Lawson, I want to apologize personally. I knew something wasn't right about that pool heater installation, but I didn't push hard enough for answers. I should have stopped this before it started. You should have, I agreed. But at least you did the right thing today. She nodded and left. Marcus and I walked out to the parking lot together. You did good in there, he said, clapping me on the shoulder. Not many people would have stood up to them like you did. I just couldn't let them get away with it. If I had rolled over, they would have kept doing this to other people. You're right. And speaking of other people, what do you want to do about those 7 families you mentioned? Were you serious about a class action? I was. If they want to pursue it, I'll help however I can. Let's set up a meeting with all of them, see what kind of cases they have. We might be able to force some real change in this HOA. Over the next month, several things happened. The settlement money came through and the propane line was removed by a licensed, legitimate contractor who repaired my yard and left everything better than he found it. The letter went out to all Meadowbrook Springs residents and the response was explosive. Dozens of people reached out to share their own HOA horror stories. It turned out Barbara had been running the board like her personal fiefdom for 6 years, and a lot of people had complaints. Marcus organized a meeting at Linda Foster's house with the families who wanted to pursue action against the HOA. We had 9 families show up, each with their own story of fines, harassment, and abuse. After listening to everyone, Marcus determined that 5 of the cases were strong enough to pursue. We filed a class action lawsuit against the HOA for systematic abuse of power, harassment, and violation of resident rights. Meanwhile, the police investigation into Barbara and the HOA continued. It turned out that the unlicensed contractor had done a lot of work for Barbara over the years, much of it questionable or outright illegal. Barbara had been using HOA funds to pay for some of her personal home improvements, disguising them as community expenses. She had also been taking kickbacks from certain vendors who were given exclusive contracts to work in Meadowbrook Springs. 3 months after our settlement, Barbara Hendricks was arrested and charged with embezzlement, theft, and fraud. The charges stemmed from her misuse of HOA funds over several years, totaling more than $50,000. The story made the local news, And suddenly our little HOA drama became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked HOA authority. I was interviewed by a local news station. The reporter, a young woman named Sarah Chen, seemed genuinely outraged by what had happened. "So they just tapped into your propane tank without asking?" she said during the interview, her eyes wide. "That's right. They ran a line from my personal tank to heat the community pool, and they did it deliberately because they thought I wouldn't notice. And when you did notice and shut off your own propane, they tried to fine you $500 for refusing to let them continue stealing from me." The interview aired that evening and my phone started ringing off the hook. Other people from other HOAs around Scottsdale started reaching out, sharing their own stories. Marcus was getting so many calls that he had to bring in another attorney to help handle the workload. The class action lawsuit moved forward, and the HOA's insurance company decided they didn't want to fight it. They settled for $120,000 to be distributed among the plaintiffs, plus an agreement that the HOA would implement a complete overhaul of its governance structure. An independent management company would be brought in to audit the HOA's finances and ensure proper oversight going forward. Elections for new board members were held in July. Linda Foster ran and won a seat, as did 2 other reform-minded candidates. The new board's first action was to repeal about half of the existing HOA rules, including all the ridiculous ones about trash cans and grass length and curtain colors. They also implemented new policies requiring transparency, regular audits, and resident approval for any significant expenditures. Barbara's criminal trial was scheduled for September. Marcus told me I would probably be called as a witness, since my case was part of what triggered the investigation. I was fine with that. I wanted to see this through to the end. In August, I had my propane tank filled again for the first time since shutting off the valve back in March. My bill was $78, normal, what it should have been all along. I was sitting on my back patio one evening, grilling some steaks and enjoying a beer, when Linda Foster stopped by. "Hey, neighbor," she called from the fence. "Mind if I come over?" "Come on around," I said. "I've got extra steak if you want one." She came through the side gate, carrying a bottle of wine. "I brought a gift, to thank you for everything you did." "I didn't do anything except refuse to be a victim," I said. "You did more than that. You stood up when most people would have backed down. You changed this whole community for the better." She handed me the wine and sat down in one of my patio chairs. "The new board had our first meeting last night. We're going to rename the pool area the Lawson Community Pool in honor of your fight." I laughed. "That's not necessary. We think it is. You saved this HOA from itself. The least we can do is name a pool after you, as long as I don't have to pay to heat it." She grinned. "No, we're installing solar heating, much more economical, and definitely more legal." We sat and talked for a while, and she told me about the new board's plans for the community. They were going to focus on actual community building, things like neighborhood events and improving common areas, rather than just enforcement and fines. It sounded like Meadowbrook Springs was going to become the kind of place I had hoped it would be when I first moved in. Barbara's trial came in late September. I was indeed called as a witness, and I testified about discovering the propane line, the harassment that followed, and the settlement. The prosecutor used my case as an example of Barbara's pattern of behavior, showing how she had consistently abused her position for personal gain and to exert control over residents. The trial lasted a week. The evidence against Barbara was overwhelming. In addition to my case, prosecutors showed how she had embezzled HOA funds, taken kickbacks, and used her position to harass residents who disagreed with her. Multiple neighbors testified about the hostile environment she had created. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding her guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge was harsh. Barbara was given 3 years in prison in order to pay full restitution to the HOA and all affected residents. She was also banned from serving on any HOA board in Arizona for life. I sat in the courtroom and watched as they led her away in handcuffs. Part of me felt bad for her. She had destroyed her own life through greed and arrogance. But another part of me felt that justice had been served. She had hurt a lot of people over the years, and she needed to face consequences. After the sentencing, I met Marcus outside the courthouse. He was practically glowing with satisfaction. "That was beautiful," he said. 3 years and full restitution." The judge threw the book at her. "Do you think she'll appeal?" "Probably. But she's not going to win. The evidence was too strong." He shook my hand. "You did a good thing, Brandon. You really did." Life in Meadowbrook Springs slowly returned to normal, but it was a different kind of normal. The new HOA board was responsive and reasonable. Rules were enforced fairly and sensibly. The harassment and fear that had characterized Barbara's reign were gone, replaced with actual community spirit. I got to know my neighbors better. Linda and I became good friends, and she introduced me to other people in the subdivision who I probably never would have met otherwise. We started having regular neighborhood barbecues, rotating through different houses. It felt like an actual community rather than just a collection of houses forced to coexist under an authoritarian regime. My propane bills stayed normal, around $70 to $80 a month depending on usage. Every time I filled my tank, I remembered that moment in March when I had stood there staring at that illegal line, debating whether to shut the valve. I was glad I had, not just because it led to justice for me, but because it had freed an entire community from a corrupt system. The renamed Lawson Community Pool opened for the season in May of the following year with a small dedication ceremony. I was asked to say a few words which felt surreal. I kept it short. When I moved to Meadowbrook Springs, I just wanted a nice place to live. I didn't expect to end up fighting the HOA or having a pool named after me. But what I learned through all of this is that standing up for yourself matters, not just for you, but for everyone around you. When we let bullies get away with bad behavior, whether they're individuals or institutions, we enable them to hurt more people. Thank you all for your support during that fight, and thank you to the new board for creating the kind of community we all deserve. People applauded, and then we all went swimming. The water was warm, heated by the new solar system. My propane tank remained untapped exactly as it should be. Dennis Yates, the former board member who had been complicit in Barbara's schemes, approached me at the pool party. He had resigned from the board after the settlement but still lived in the community. "Mr. Lawson, I owe you an apology," he said, looking uncomfortable. "I should have stopped Barbara when I had the chance. I knew what she was doing wasn't right, but I was too much of a coward to speak up. What you did, standing up to her, that took real courage. I'm sorry I didn't have that courage myself." "Thank you for saying that," I said. "It takes guts to admit you were wrong." He nodded and walked away. I appreciated the apology, even if it was a couple years too late. As the summer went on, Meadowbrook Springs continued to thrive under its new leadership. The community garden that had been proposed for years but always rejected by Barbara's board was finally installed. New playground equipment was added to the small park near the entrance. The monthly meetings that had once been contentious affairs where Barbara ruled with an iron fist became actual discussions where residents had input and voices. I started dating someone I met at one of the neighborhood barbecues, a woman named Rachel who lived 2 streets over. She had heard about my fight with the HOA before we met, and she told me it was part of what made her interested in getting to know me. "I like a man who stands up for what's right," she said over dinner one night. "Most people would have just paid the extra propane costs and grumbled about it. You actually did something." "I was just tired of being pushed around," I said. "That's what makes it impressive. You reached your limit and you pushed back. The world needs more people like that." Life was good, better than it had been in a long time. My house felt like home. My community felt like an actual community, and I had peace of mind knowing that my propane tank was serving only my own needs. About 18 months after Barbara's sentencing, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Barbara herself, postmarked from the women's correctional facility where she was serving her sentence. I debated whether to read it, but curiosity won out. The letter was surprisingly humble. She apologized for what she had done not just to me but to the entire community. She talked about how prison had given her time to reflect on her behavior and how she had let power go to her head. She said she understood why I had done what I did and that she didn't blame me for the consequences she was facing. She hoped that someday I might be able to forgive her, but she understood if I couldn't. I read the letter twice, then filed it away. I didn't know if I forgave her or not. The hurt and anger had faded, replaced mostly with indifference. She had made her choices and she was paying for them. Whether I forgave her didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. What mattered was that justice had been served and that our community was healing. I never wrote back to her. I didn't know what I would say. Maybe someday I would feel differently, but for now I was content to let that chapter of my life remain closed. Marcus and I stayed in touch, getting lunch every couple of months. He had taken on several more HOA abuse cases as a result of the publicity from mine, and he was becoming something of a specialist in the field. He told me he was considering writing a book about HOA reform. "You should be a chapter," he said. "The guy who shut off his propane and changed everything." I didn't change everything. I just stood up for myself. That's how change starts. One person saying enough is enough. By the time the 2-year anniversary of my propane discovery rolled around, Meadowbrook Springs was almost unrecognizable from the place I had moved into. The fear and tension were gone. People were happy to live there. The HOA served its intended purpose of maintaining the community without overstepping into tyranny. Property values had actually gone up, not despite the loosening of rules, but because of it. People wanted to live in a community that was managed fairly and reasonably. I was grilling in my backyard again on that anniversary, thinking about how much had changed. My propane tank sat there peacefully fueling nothing but my own grill and fire pit, exactly as it should. The gauge read 60%, normal usage, no theft, no drama. Rachel came out from the house carrying a bowl of salad. She had essentially moved in over the past few months, though we hadn't made it official yet. "You're smiling," she observed. "What are you thinking about?" "Just remembering 2 years ago when I found that propane line. How angry I was. How I almost didn't shut the valve because I thought it might cause too much trouble. I'm glad you did, otherwise we might never have met." "That's true. I wouldn't have gotten involved with the neighborhood events if the HOA hadn't changed." She set the salad down and wrapped her arms around me from behind. "You did a brave thing. You should be proud. I'm just glad it worked out. It could have gone very differently. But it didn't. That's what matters." We ate dinner on the patio as the sun set, talking about ordinary things, making plans for the weekend. The community pool was visible through the fence, its lights glowing warmly in the evening. I could hear kids laughing and splashing, normal sounds. Happy sounds. Later that night, after Rachel had gone to bed, I stood in my backyard one more time, looking at that propane tank. It had been the catalyst for so much change, and yet it was just a tank. An ordinary piece of equipment that had become extraordinary only because someone had decided to steal from it. I thought about all the things that had happened. The discovery, the confrontation, the lawsuit, the settlement, the criminal trial. All of it had started with me noticing my propane gauge was lower than it should be and having the curiosity to investigate why. If I had been less observant, less willing to question things, Barbara would still be running the HOA, still abusing her power, still making people's lives miserable. One person can make a difference. That was the lesson I took from all of this. One person who refuses to be a victim, who stands up and says this isn't right, who follows through even when it's difficult. That one person can create ripples that turn into waves that change everything. I went inside, locked the door, and turned off the patio lights. My propane tank sat in the darkness, doing its job, nothing more and nothing less, exactly as it should be. The next morning, I woke to find an email from Linda Foster. The HOA board was planning a 2-year celebration event for the community, marking 2 years since the reforms had been implemented. They wanted me to be part of the planning committee. I replied that I would be happy to help. After all, this community had become my home, truly my home, in a way it never could have been under Barbara's rule. I had fought for it, and now I wanted to help nurture it. The celebration event was held in early October. We had it at the community pool, naturally, with food trucks, live music, and games for kids. The turnout was huge, with nearly every family in Meadowbrook Springs attending. Linda gave a speech thanking everyone who had contributed to the community's transformation, and she specifically mentioned me, Marcus, and the other residents who had been part of the class action lawsuit. 2 years ago, this was a different community, she said into the microphone. It was a place where people were afraid of their own HOA, where rules were enforced capriciously, where one person's power had corrupted the entire system. But because some brave residents stood up and said enough is enough, we changed. We became what an HOA should be, a group of neighbors working together to maintain and improve our community, not a dictatorship. So thank you to Brandon Lawson, Linda Foster, Marcus Weinstein, and everyone else who fought for this change. This community is better because of you. People applauded, and I felt a swell of emotion. It had been a long road, and there had been times when I wasn't sure if fighting was worth it. But standing there looking at my neighbors, seeing kids playing happily, watching people actually enjoy living here, I knew it had been worth every moment of stress and conflict. The party went late into the evening. I talked to dozens of people, some of whom thanked me personally for what I had done. It was humbling and gratifying in equal measure. This was what community should feel like. Not fear and resentment, but genuine connection and mutual support. As the party was winding down and I was helping to clean up, a man I didn't recognize approached me. He was maybe in his late 30s, wearing jeans and a polo shirt. "Mr. Lawson, I'm David Miller. I just moved into Meadowbrook Springs last month." "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, shaking his hand. "I wanted to thank you. I almost didn't buy here because I heard about the HOA issues a couple years ago. But then I read about what you did, how you fought back and changed things. That's what convinced me this was a good place to live. My wife and I, we have 3 kids. And we wanted to be somewhere with actual community spirit. You helped create that. I appreciate you saying that. But it was a lot of people working together, not just me maybe. But you were the one who started it. You were the one who shut off that valve and refused to back down. That took guts." We talked for a few more minutes and then he went to wrangle his kids. I stood there thinking about what he had said. I had started it by shutting off that valve. Such a simple action, really. Turn a valve, stop the flow of propane. But that simple action had led to everything else. The confrontation, the lawsuit, the investigation, the trial, the reforms, the transformation of an entire community. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance lead to the biggest changes. I finished helping with cleanup and walked home with Rachel. The night was cool and pleasant, typical for October in Arizona. We walked hand in hand, not talking, just enjoying the evening in each other's company. When we got to my house, I paused in the backyard to check on my propane tank out of habit. The gauge read 55% normal, expected mine. "Still checking on it?" Rachel asked with a smile. "Old habits, I probably always will. That tank is a part of history now. The famous tank that started a revolution." I laughed. "I wouldn't call it a revolution. More like a course correction. Whatever you want to call it, it mattered. You mattered." We went inside and life continued. Normal life. Good life. The life I had wanted when I first moved to Meadowbrook Springs. In the years that followed, the community continued to thrive. The reforms held. New board members were elected who maintained the spirit of fairness and transparency that had been established. Rules were updated as needed, always with resident input. Fines were rare and reserved for actual violations that affected safety or property values, not petty nonsense about trash cans and curtains. Barbara served her full 3-year sentence and was released. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved to Nevada to live with her sister. She never returned to Meadowbrook Springs. I hoped she had learned something from her experience, but I honestly didn't spend much time thinking about her. She was part of my past, not my present. Marcus's book about HOA reform was published and became a minor bestseller, at least in legal and homeowner circles. He sent me a signed copy with a note. "Thanks for being the inspiration. You started something important." My case was indeed a full chapter, titled "The Propane Tank That Changed Everything." It was surreal to read about my own experience in a book, but Marcus had done a good job telling the story and drawing larger lessons from it. Rachel and I got married in a small ceremony at, appropriately enough, the Lawson community pool. It seemed fitting to celebrate our new beginning at the place that represented so much change and growth. Linda officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. Our neighbors attended, filling the pool area with love and support. As I stood there saying my vows, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. If I hadn't noticed that propane gauge, if I hadn't investigated, if I hadn't shut off that valve, if I hadn't stood up to Barbara, none of this would have happened. I would be living in a different community, probably never having met Rachel, certainly never having experienced the satisfaction of fighting for what's right and winning. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had just let it go. If I had noticed the propane theft but decided it wasn't worth the fight. Barbara would still be running the HOA, or at least would have been until someone else finally stood up to her. More people would have been hurt, more money would have been stolen. More residents would have been harassed, but I didn't let it go. I shut that valve and everything changed. That's the thing about standing up to bullies, whether they're individuals or institutions. It's not easy. It's not comfortable. It requires courage and persistence and a willingness to face conflict. But it's necessary, because bullies only stop when someone makes them stop. My propane tank still sits in my backyard, feeding my grill and my fire pit and nothing else. The gauge goes up when I fill it and down when I use it, exactly as it should. It's just a tank, an ordinary piece of equipment, but to me it will always represent something more. It represents the moment I decided I wasn't going to be a victim, the moment I chose to fight back, the moment everything changed. And every time I fire up my grill on a warm Arizona evening, surrounded by friends and neighbors in the community we built together, I'm grateful for that moment. Grateful that I noticed. Grateful that I investigated. Grateful that I had the courage to reach out and shut that valve, because that simple action, turning a valve to stop the flow of stolen propane, didn't just save me money or win me a lawsuit. It freed an entire community from tyranny and created something better in its place. It proved that one person really can make a difference, if they're willing to stand up and fight for what's right. The propane keeps flowing to my equipment, and only my equipment, exactly as it should. And life in Meadowbrook Springs goes on better and brighter than it ever was before. All because I shut a valve and refused to back down. That's my story. The story of how a propane tank, an HOA board's greed, and one man's refusal to be victimized changed everything. It's not a story about grand heroics or dramatic confrontations, though there were certainly dramatic moments. It's a story about ordinary people finding the courage to stand up for themselves and their community. It's a story about how small acts of resistance can lead to big changes. It's a story about justice eventually prevailing. And every time I check that propane gauge and see it reading exactly what it should, I smile, remembering how far we have all come, from that moment of discovery to this moment of peace, from theft and tyranny to fairness and community, from fear to freedom. All because one person noticed something wrong and decided to do something about it.